There are two projects that Marvel has dropped in recent years that stand out to me. Those projects being the MCU's Secret Invasion and the Square Enix Avengers game. The reason these two stand out to me is because they both flopped hard, not just financially, but in terms of fan reception as well. People hated Marvel's Avengers. The campaign was divisive in terms of perceived quality, the multiplayer aspect was seen as inherently flawed by many, and the gameplay was often criticized as repetitive and dull. People also hated Secret Invasion. It was too small scale, underwhelming, a CGI mess, and just plain boring, not to mention a shadow of the comic it was based off of. And you want to know something interesting? We could have gotten a combination of both of those projects as far back as when the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360 were still the primary gaming consoles of the world. We could have gotten a Secret Invasion Avengers game. I am of course referring to the cancelled project that was being developed by a now defunct THQ Studios back in the early 2010s. Now I only recently discovered that this game was ever even a thing, and I'm a big fan of the Skrulls in the comics. You know, I've always wanted more content with them across movies and TV and even video games, so to hear that there was an entire game centered around the Secret Invasion storyline in the comics was equally infuriating and fascinating. For some backstory, THQ Studios acquired the rights from Marvel back in 2010 with the intention to release the project alongside the first Avengers movie that would release a couple years later. Interestingly enough, it was never the intention of Marvel or THQ to make the game similar to the movie at all. It didn't seem to even be an afterthought. There was no Loki, there was no Chitauri, and only 4 of the Avengers in the movie were actually present in the game, which we'll get back to later. This is something that's quite rare for Marvel nowadays, in an era of constant MCU synchronization and comics, animation, video games, and so on. Now, THQ's primary goal was always to create a semi-original story based off of the source material from the comics. They even brought in the writer of the original Secret Invasion storyline, Brian Michael Bendis, who you may know as the creator of Miles Morales, Jessica Jones, Ultimate Spider-Man, Riri Williams, Maria Hill, Daisy Johnson, Ronin, and so on, to write the script for the game. THQ always set out to make this a first-person co-op game so that the player could become fully immersed in the world and take on the invasion himself, and so players would actually be rewarded for working together as a team. This is where you start to see a lot of the similarities to the Square Enix game from 2020. When you look at the player customization menus, they both look very similar. Also, tiny little details like the power move section in the bottom right corner, the revive system, the movement of the Skrull enemies also highly resembles the aimbots in the 2020 game when they try to attack you. Also, I gotta say, I love that the motivation to keep the game super close to the comics runs as deep as giving the Skrull soldiers their classic matching uniforms from the comics. One of the minor things that always bothered me about the Square Enix game is the way almost none of the AIM foot soldiers actually have the matching uniforms to them, you know, that beekeeper look. So to see that THQ was actually thinking about the comic accuracy that much is nice, and it makes it all the more tragic that we never got the game. So why did we never get the game? What happened? Well, to clarify, THQ is the company that bought the rights from Marvel to publish an Avengers game. THQ owned a sub-company by the name of THQ Studios Australia. So while THQ was publishing the Avengers game, THQ Australia was the company actually making it and developing it for the Xbox and the PlayStation. Meanwhile, another one of THQ's subsidiary companies by the name of Blue Tongue Entertainment worked on a PC version of the same game. So the reason THQ was struggling all the way at the top was actually a result of a lot of things. In 2010, they came out with a certain video game device that you may or may not recognize called the U-Draw. Now, you may recognize the Wii version, which came out first, or maybe the Xbox or PS3 versions that came out later, but if you don't remember seeing any of these things, that's perfectly understandable too, because these product launches would actually be remembered as company-killing disasters. As you can probably imagine, the U-Draw was a drawing device made for video games. When THQ first shipped out the Wii version of the U-Draw in 2010, it came bundled with an art-based video game called U-Draw Studio. This launch was met with decent success, nothing special, but nothing too bad either. This encouraged THQ to go bigger and expand the product to other major consoles at the time. This is what led to the trouble. What likely happened is THQ got too big for their britches and wanted to really go all out and get ambitious. You know, this is a company that was responsible for the DS game Drawn to Life in 2007, which, although got fairly average reviews all across the board, was praised by company investors for selling over 800,000 units over the course of the holiday season. season. Drawn to Life was also ranked 61st on the top 100 selling video games for that year, and was met with multiple award wins and nominations. Now, while THQ published Drawn to Life, the game was actually developed by a different independent studio by the name of Fifth Cell. Now, Fifth Cell was actually courted to work with Nintendo to create an art-based video game for the DS by the name of Scribblenauts, which released just 2 years later. Scribblenauts generally got pretty high reviews and sold almost 200,000 copies in just the first month of its September release. The Scribblenauts franchise eventually expanded out to other major consoles like the Wii, PlayStation, Xbox, and so on, and led to an overall lifelong sales figure of 13 million copies. Now, THQ was a company that largely got by over time by licensing from big companies like Marvel, Disney, Warner Brothers, and so on to create video games for already established media franchises. You know, they were the company behind a lot of the WWE games, SpongeBob, Toy Story, largely movies and shows with a wide audience of children and adults alike. THQ very rarely made video games from their own original IP with brand new stories. Drawn to Life was one of the few to actually be their own thing and perform that well. So having a bigger company like Nintendo, who already has a large audience of both adults and children, to have them use the same developers to create a somewhat more successful art-based game for the DS, it likely had THQ at worst seeing Scribblenauts as a more successful competitor, and at best, they saw that there was a large audience and money to be made from art-based games and wanted to make big moves to take over the genre. Hence, the U-Draw, with a stylus just like the Nintendo DS and the attempt to sell wide across all consoles like the Wii, PS3, and Xbox, just as Nintendo had done with the Scribblenauts franchise. Unfortunately, THQ drastically overestimated how much people actually wanted drawing-based video games. The release of the U-Draw in 2011 for the PS3 and Xbox 360 flopped so badly they ceased production within 4 months. And it makes sense why it bombed, really. I mean, this was 2011. Think about what games were coming out back then on the PlayStation and the Xbox. Batman Arkham City, Dark Souls, Modern Warfare 3, Mortal Kombat, Portal 2, Star Wars The Old Republic, Gears of War 3, Battlefield 3. You know, the video game industry was only becoming more and more mature. Nobody wanted to draw. So to release the U-Draw as a Wii exclusive probably would have been just fine. Like I said, that initial launch was met with decent enough success. But to try and push it to other consoles like the PS3 and the Xbox 360 was what the former president of THQ described as one of many massive mistakes. According to THQ's CFO, Paul Pacino, the company had a revenue shortfall of over $100 million, largely due to the fact that they had over 1 million units of product sitting in warehouses untouched and unsold. That's 1 million U-Draws that nobody wanted. THQ tried to make a big move to sell a brand new product and ended up losing hundreds of millions because of it. Not long after this massive failure for the brand, THQ quickly re-strategized, telling investors that they were discontinuing the product effective immediately, and that they were going to focus on their core audience and fighting franchises aimed at adults, the Avengers game that they were developing being one of them, which fit much more with the current climate of video games. Unfortunately, it was too late. The company had already had one foot in the grave and they just couldn't see it yet. Blue Tongue Entertainment and THQ Studios Australia were both studios based out of, as you can guess, Australia. Now, back in 2010 and 2011, when these companies were working on our Avengers game, Australia was going through a little bit of an economic boost. We all know about the stock market fiasco in the United States during 2008. I won't get into all the garbage about money and all that. This is a Marvel history lesson, not a US history lesson, but basically the US's dollar became less and less valuable as inflation rose, which in turn made the Australian dollar more valuable. So, a US-based company like THQ had to pay more money to the employees of all its subsidiary companies based in Australia because the US dollar was not as expensive as the Australian dollar. So on top of losing $100 million in revenue from the U-Draw fiasco, THQ now had to pay their workers in other countries even more from something that they had absolutely no control over. Suddenly, THQ's new strategy of focusing on the more adult fighting franchises didn't sound like such a good way to preserve money. But they held on for life, releasing a new game in 2011 called Homefront, which was another attempt to match the current climate of more mature video games. And even though this project did sell over 2 million copies, it was actually shrouded in controversies due to how similar it was to conflicts that other countries were having with North Korea at the time, as well as very brave attempts at marketing the game. The game was also met with positive, but overall fairly mixed to average reviews. You know, it was a decent launch, but nowhere near enough to save THQ from their financial troubles, not to mention how it rattled the brand reputation of the company. Needless to say, things were not looking good for THQ. They were losing money on products that never should have been made. They'd failed to properly assess the current climate of the industry they worked in in until it was too late. They were facing heavy controversies in the media due to very risky decisions in marketing, and they were shelling out more and more money to their non-domestic companies just to keep their employees working on projects, just to keep the company afloat with new games. THQ was bleeding, and everyone there knew that they were in trouble. They had to make a big move to pull the company through this dire period and survive it. They had one game left that could help them. One game based off licensed IP for a slowly expanding movie franchise. Could this be the game that they make that pulls THQ out of its rut? It had to be. They had no other choice. But even if their Avengers game sold exceptionally, it wouldn't make a dent in their Australian subsidiaries if they continued to bleed them dry in the meantime. They were losing tons of money that they already didn't have every single day. Something needed to be done in order for their efforts to make a difference. So they took a gamble. As THQ's former president Jason Rubin once said about the matter, THQ had to be restructured in order to survive. THQ made the incredibly risky decision to announce the shutdown of both THQ Studios Australia and Blue Tongue Entertainment while they were still working on the Avengers game, so that on their way out the employees could hopefully push out a finished version of this Avengers game, which would allow THQ to reap the benefits of a successful launch and bring the company back from the edge of the cliff, even though it would cost them two of their subsidiary companies. But in order to finish the game, THQ still had to pay their employees with money they didn't have, which didn't solve the problem that they were currently facing. So, with that in hand, THQ miserably walked back to Marvel, the ones they'd bought the license from in the first place, and they asked them to help fund the project so they could carry out the production of the game and bring the plan of releasing it alongside the movie to fruition. And Marvel said no. Now, at face value, this decision might seem a little weird, but trust me, from Marvel's point of view, it makes perfect sense. When choosing to fund a project as a company, you have to evaluate what's in it for you. In the world of business, everything is about money. When handing out your money to someone else, you have to think about what money you're gonna get back. More specifically, what profit you're gonna make back. You also have to evaluate the person you're lending the money to. If you don't know the people you're doing business with, how can you trust them with your money? Moreover, how can you expect them to be smart enough to make it back and more to make the overall business venture worthwhile? Think about this through Marvel's eyes. They were looking at a company with a gunshot wound limping towards them. As far as Marvel was concerned, THQ was asking for another bullet in the chest. They were bleeding millions. They were in bad shape. We've covered this. And then they come knocking at your door asking for your money to bleed? No way. Marvel had too much in the works to dance with death like that. They had a cinematic universe that they were trying to get off the ground for the first time ever, with an upcoming team-up movie that was the first of its kind. This movie was big. Not to mention the fact that Marvel had just barely avoided bankruptcy in the 90s as it is, and this was only done by selling off a lot of their properties like Spider-Man to Sony, X-Men and the Fantastic Four to Fox, Hulk to Universal, and so on. All of the studios they were competing with had successful franchises made out of popular teams from Marvel Comics. All Marvel Studios had at the time was the Avengers. This was their last shot to get skin in the superhero movie game and take their company to the next level. They were shooting for Hollywood. There was already too much on the table for them as it was. They could not in good conscience indulge a company that had made error after error after error. So while the Secret Invasion game was the last shot for THQ, the Avengers movie was kind of a last shot for Marvel Studios. If the Avengers game bombed, Marvel lost money funding a project of a studio that was doomed to shut down anyway. If the Avengers movie bombed, Marvel will have lost hundreds of millions making it, and the game would be a lot less likely to get sales from an unpopular movie, and then they'd both still be doomed. There were way too many gambles all across the board for anyone to be comfortable with. There was no logic in funding the game. The way Marvel likely saw it was that THQ's best chance of survival was to make like them in the 90s and sell off as much IP as they possibly could if they hoped to restructure. Cut costs, cancel projects, quit while you're ahead, and then if THQ sold off their license to make an Avengers game to a different company, Marvel might still have a chance at a video game getting released from a different studio alongside their movie without having to shell out any more money to make it happen. So while THQ had everything to gain from Marvel funding the project, Marvel had everything to gain by not funding it. With no way to fund the project and the closure of their subsidiaries, THQ was forced to cancel the project. They sold off all their assets, including the licenses to many popular media franchises like Marvel's Avengers. But with most of their money over the years coming from games based off of licensed IP from other companies, they really had nothing left to survive off of, which means that THQ as a whole eventually shut down too. So when they were selling off their assets to other companies, where'd the the Avengers license end up? Well, that eventually went to Ubisoft, who took it and made Avengers: The Battle for Earth. So if you were wondering how the idea for that game was born, or why Marvel randomly decided to throw out an Injustice-style fighting game based off the Secret Invasion storyline in the comics, Ubisoft was just working with what they had, trying to fit the agreement and storyline that had already been established between THQ and Marvel, just with a lot shorter of a timeline, hence why the game is really nothing special. So in a way, the spirit of THQ's game lived on in another project. Actually, if we're being honest, it lived on in 2 projects. Overall, I gotta say, it sucks that THQ's Secret Invasion game never happened, but it's nice to see that certain parts of it survived. The story of THQ's downfall is just a prime example of how businesses will always be risky no matter how successful a company might be. And even though I wish Marvel had helped fund the project, I understand why they didn't. The game seemed really cool in retrospect. The graphics in the HUD kinda gave me some Halo vibes. That combined with the design choices of the maps, as well as the 4-player co-op aspect, really makes it feel like a first-person version of the Ultimate Alliance games, and it's kinda cool to see so many strong similarities carried across all different types of Marvel video games like that. But yeah, it really makes me sad when ideas like this fall through. You know, I feel like this one could have been a really cool, classic Marvel game, you know, that honestly might have had a really good chance of survival back in the 2012 gaming industry, but I guess things don't always work out, unfortunately. By the way, a lot of the old unfinished gameplay footage from this game can actually be found right here on YouTube, so you should definitely do that. It's more than worth it to check it out. It's really cool to like look back and see what games in development, you know, looked like back then. And yeah, I mean, if you just want to see the similarities between that game and, you know, Square Enix's Avengers, you know, I think you'll definitely be able to tell and point out certain things that are shared between the two. But yeah, man, after all is said and done, it's really interesting to think about how this game would have been received by the public, you know, had they released it the way they intended to. You know, it really leaves me curious about whether or not it would have flopped like the 2020 game did, whether it would have flopped like Secret Invasion on Disney Plus did, or hell, you know, maybe it would have brought audiences exactly what was missing from both of those projects. What do you think? Was this a missed opportunity, or was it canceled for good reason? A game that seemed too good to be true in retrospect, or a gift we never got? Let me know your thoughts down below, and check out my other videos here. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.